Welcome. I'm delighted to say that I'm in Bilbao, one of my favorite cities in Europe. When I say small is beautiful, I think of Bilbao because it's the most livable city, in my view, amongst the most livable cities in Europe. And I'm delighted to introduce a dear friend and a very distinguished scholar, a professor of sociology at University College Dublin and a member of the Royal Irish Academy, but also a great friend of Bilbao and the Basque Country. Andreas Hess published a book on reluctant modernization, plebeian culture and moral economy in the Basque Country. And he will tell us about the way in which European Union works in places like Bilbao, or doesn't. Or doesn't. And so for me, one of the key questions we cover in the subject is how the EU is governed, how the European Union is experienced in localities, in cities of Europe, like Bilbao.
Yeah, but in order to answer that question, you have to go back a little bit and see what are the foundation blocks and the structural components of what makes Europe tick. And the structural component is, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you look at it, the nation state.
The nation state. The nation state is the central unit, but then the EU can sometimes counterbalance the nation state. I mean, we tell our students, of course, that the EU is still ruled by the member states. The member states are what the Germans call the Herren der Verträge, right? They are the rulers of the treaties, right? The Commission is the guardian of the treaties, but the EU can also counterbalance the nation states.
That is true. There are lots of rights and money and support that regions can claim in Europe, but the problem still remains the core unit element is the nation state. And that means at one moment in European history, the European Union has decided to almost arrest development by design and saying, these are the components that we have. You can have new members as nation states, but not as regions. And, well, hence some of the problems that we see with Europe when resurging nationalisms or nationalisms that go back a long way before the European Union started, are still alive and kicking. So against what a famous German philosopher Habermas has said, that we've reached a post-national environment, well, not so, I would argue, or not completely. I mean, things have changed. There are dynamisms in both directions, local, national, and the supranational level. But hence all the complications. And the European Union has been relatively good at responding to that so far, but they have also sometimes failed. So, to use an example, so why is it possible that new accession states like the ones in the Baltic republics were relatively small, also in terms of regional size, but also in terms of size of population, have a right to become members, independent nation state members with a full vote, while other regions in Europe of the similar size, let's name the three famous cases, Scotland, Catalonia, and the Basque Country, don't have those rights.
And this is where Spain offers such a kind of fascinating example of the problem we are looking at. And we are looking at the problem of what is the appropriate size of a political unit, right? Or how does Europe work as a kind of multi-level governance system. So Spain exemplifies that question of who is responsible for what at what level, right? And when it works, then you can present it as a marvelous example, but Spain also shows that these conflicts can get ugly, and there is a history of violent contestation, right, about the level.
Sure, but why do we always blame, would be my counter-argument, why do we always blame the regions for that and not the highly centralized nation states? I mean, and then you have various nation states in Europe which follow different models. So, let's say France...
A Republican model, right?
Well, France, then, but highly centralized.
Yes.
Then you have formerly, before the Brexit, you had the United Kingdom, 4 or 3.5 unequal regional components.
And Ireland, what about Ireland? You are based in Ireland.
I'm based in Ireland, where we have a problem that still isn't fully resolved. Whether it ever can be resolved, we don't know. And
With Northern Ireland.
With Northern Ireland and
Brexit,
and the Republic. And then we have, of course, as you mentioned, the Spanish case, where you have an unequal, how can I put it? It's very hard. It's a kind of hybrid thing. So you have some rights for autonomous regions, but they're all equal in that, but some are more equal than others.
That's the thing. That's the sense I get, that people in this region, that is the Basque Country, tend to be more satisfied with the current arrangements, while Catalans still can't quite come to terms. And they perceive the central government as too tyrannical, some of them, right? While in the Basque Country you get a sense that they are largely satisfied with the current arrangement.
Yeah, but the problem is that, against the kind of stories that the Spanish government likes to tell about itself, or to spin the story about itself and its legitimacy, it's not that straightforward. There are inheritances from times preceding the current Spanish Republic that go back a long time. We don't have to start with prehistoric times, but let's just look at, let's say, the course of the 19th century. Spain is in a mess. Basically, the liberal arrangements through the liberal republic, because liberalism in Spain was introduced with the help of French troops from the republic.
Yes.
So, needless to say, people think, what kind of freedom is this that's being delivered?
Napoleonic War.
Yeah, that's been delivered by French troops, who then, basically helped with the support of the French, the first or second constitution it is, I think, being set up, a liberal constitution, which didn't work very long. In the 19th century, it's a total mess. We have ongoing wars.
We're talking about early 19th century.
Throughout the 19th century, it's never been resolved. You have 3 Carlist wars. You ask any, even Spanish historian and specialists on the issue, inherently complex to understand, because you have elements
but that's all too European, isn't it? There are messy stories of nation building across Europe, 19th century, right?
Absolutely.
And as you said, the result is a fairly complex but solidified appearance of nation states. The French story, if we fast forward to the 20th century, is complicated by the Franco's dictatorship and the messy civil war that is followed by Franco's dictatorship. But the usual story you read in EU textbooks is that by the time the Spaniards free themselves of Franco, enter the European Union, the liberal democratic traditions become firmly anchored in the EU, and there the EU or its predecessor plays a stabilizing.
Well, it's a lie that people like to. That's the official line of maybe the Spanish and the European government to justify their actions. The story in reality is much more complex. So if we take a closer look at, once the Second World War is over, Franco is still in power. Now, everybody who was resistant to the Franco regime hoped that with the end of the Second World War, Franco would be history as well.
Yes.
Well, then we have about an intermediate period of 5 to 7, 8 years in which the Cold War becomes a crucial feature. And in the Cold War, suddenly Franco's Spain becomes acceptable.
Because the US is keen to have a strong ally.
A strong ally. Then Franco Spain is allowed to become part of the United Nations.
And the focus is on containing the spread of the Soviet Empire,
sure,
right?
Against communism.
And Franco had strong anti-communist credentials.
Absolutely. And he played that card, or the government of Franco played that part quite well, and played the European Union. And within that, the Basque Country has a very unique place. It was probably the most anti-Franco, but most pro-European party.
I see.
The Basque Nationalist Party, the PNV, was a crucial element in the founding moments of the European Union. 20, 30 years later, all forgotten.
No one wants to know about it.
Nobody wants to know about it, about the complications.
Because it undermines the
logic of the
centralized
nation state.
And that is the point that you stated at the outset, that the EU focuses too much on nation states, so much so that even history is constructed to fit that.
Absolutely. It's a story that, look, I mean, if you're successful, that's a story you like to spin about yourself. And to a certain extent, it has worked. It has worked. It's not like, I'm not saying it has no power. It has. And to a certain extent, both sides have moved to a certain extent. But as we've seen there are moments when the wish for autonomy or more independence, independence-like government in Scotland, Catalonia, are rampant, and how the European Union basically says, can't be, we can't have that now. We can have former communist parties entering, but not
former communist countries.
Entering as nation
like
states.
Croatia or Slovenia, minuscule.
Baltic republics. Yes. Next time Kosovo, right?
Yes.
Or Bosnia Herzegovina. Yes. So why do they have the right and others don't, who have a much longer history?
So this is now a superficial observation. I've been to Bilbao many times, and it strikes me truly as a well-governed, prosperous, comfortable place to live in. So the question now for me is Bilbao great because it is European, or is Europe great because it has cities and regions like Bilbao? The question is about how is Europe ruled, who has the power at what level, and is then the EU conducive to that local government that Bilbao?
To a certain extent it is. If you have a pro-European nationalist government in place, as you have, and as you have for the last, since 1977.
Regardless whether it's conservative or...
Not regardless. We have continuously a PNV in power, minus a couple of years in the 90s.
Spell it out, the name of the party.
Partido Nacionalista Vasco is the Basque Nationalist Party, which is, if you want, the building block, the most pro-European party that you can imagine. But at the same time, who is keen on wanting have more rights, if possible.
Within Spain.
But
so you are talking about...
Or, if not, if it ever happens that way, if the constellation is right, full independence.
Yes, but so you are talking about a regional government, which is interesting because I thought I was talking about national government, right? This is the perspective of an EU scholar. But at national level also, right? As long as there is pro-EU government, and there has been a consensus, both mainstream political forces, whether it's conservatives or...
Yeah, but there have been major problems. The PNV had been excluded from the European Conservative Party Alliance.
I see.
On behalf of the Partido Popular, the biggest conservative Spanish party.
The Popular.
Against one of the founders. The Partido Popular didn't even exist at the time.
Yes.
So it was the PNV who had the best European record.
I see.
Which was then prohibited and taken out of the Conservative Centre Alliance to the Christian Democratic Parties of Europe on behalf of the Partido Popular.
So there are in the European Parliament, right?
Sure.
A couple of members or whatnot.
Sure.
But they are not a part of a bigger group within the European
part now, as far as I'm concerned, of the Independent Alliance of group within the European Parliament. But no longer part of the Christian Social Democratic.
And mind you, and that is another mini lecture we have on the role of the European Parliament, which within the EU is not to be compared with national parliaments, right? The powers of the European Parliament are still constrained, and every country has a relatively small number.
Yeah, but that's then the problem. If those come together and everybody who puts the veto puts in the national government of a nation state.
Yes.
So in that, the Basque Country has no say whatsoever.
Yes. And yet, am I right to assume that most Spaniards, and that's probably true of people in the Basque Country also, are very pro-European? Like, we have had a backlash against Europe, across Europe, for a number of reasons. Well, Spain is still amongst the most pro...
You have to differentiate between various regions of Spain, or various national components that make up Spain. So there are three historical nations in Spain. The three are Galicia, then Catalonia, and the Basque Country. And then, of course, there's Castile.
Yes.
Um,
It's the smallest.
Castile is the biggest among the 4 historical ones.
Okay.
But it's the one that dominates everything
Yes,
else.
yes.
So we have issues and problems then when it comes to language issues,
Yes.
cultural issues, rights of taxation. We have there are issues that about who protects which borders, immigration policies,
Yes.
urban policies, etc., etc., etc. So not everybody is equal in that in
Yes.
Spain. And the Basque Country has been fortunate in fighting hard for its historic rights and maintaining some of those, but it's far from what it was.
I see. But it has better deal than Catalonia, and therefore a greater degree of satisfaction.
Yeah, I think
one
now
could
the
say.
Catalans are looking with envy to the
Yes.
Basque Country, and the Basque Country is quite keen at the current insecure constellation worldwide and also in Europe to defend its rights.
Yes, yes.
If there's a possibility to have more, they will go for it.
How do you see the role of the EU in that conflict, the ongoing conflict, it has to be said, over Catalonia?
I think they were partly embarrassed because here there's a manifestation of something that is obvious, a different culture, which in itself is very multicultural, but there are some defining patterns. And Scotland, you have the same thing. We have an independent, different judiciary system, not based on English case law. You got similar things in the Basque Country, some of those aspects in Catalonia. And I think Europe was surprised particularly about, I think, Scotland and Catalonia. The Basque Country, it was toned down a little bit because after the achievement of the truce between ETA and the government, I think they didn't want to.
But the leader is currently still in exile, right? There is a kind of
well, it's a weird situation,
and it has EU dimensions in terms of extradition.
but the courts have been quite good to
Okay.
Puigdemont. Up until lately, only in the last couple of weeks, there's a new development now where the order on behalf of the Spanish authorities has been seen as to complete the minimum, gets the minimum credentials in order to be processed. But, the fact is Puigdemont is still living in Belgium.
Yes,
And is now, after the outcome of the elections, the most recent national elections, in a relatively good position to say what's going to happen.
But so could you say that, particularly then in relation to Catalonia, the EU has had a kind of moderating influence on that conflict?
I think they were rather kind of didn't want to be poisoned by it.
I see. So
it was like, it's a poisonous challenge.
Yes.
Because if you start giving way and not pursuing the old national state line, this is how, and it's a dynamic thing. And I think the problem with Europe is, for a long time, that they didn't want to see that dynamic.
Yes.
They thought it was something that had come to an end historically.
Yes.
And now we're all kind of delegating our powers nicely to Brussels or to Strasbourg, and we work from there.
Yes.
But look, I mean, that's fantasy land. That's not reality.
So what is your view on the European Union? And I could have said in the introduction that your story is even more complicated in that you are a German academic, if you don't mind me saying.
Well, I have Irish citizenship, so...
and you are a member of the Royal Irish Academy, but you also have a deep love of this region, your kind of second home.
Yes.
Here. So I'll be curious, why did that happen? And what is your perception, even a personal perception, of the EU? On the one hand, you live the dream that Europe represents, the 4 freedoms, right? Like you work, you are based in Dublin, you spend a great deal of time here, so you are an EU citizen, and these are one of the privileges of EU citizenship. And yet I sense that they're also somewhat reserved in your enthusiasm towards Europe.
Yes, I mean, Europe is, politically speaking and socially speaking, a hybrid. And it has been, and I predict it will always be, at least for the foreseeable future. I don't see the United States of Europe. Sorry.
So it's neither desirable nor
I don't think it's desirable.
doable.
I mean, the idea that you can have, let's say, one, social welfare system from let's say, not the Urals now, but, let's say from the Polish borders or from the Baltic borders to Portugal, and have one system that applies to everyone, I don't think that will ever work. And probably, I think most people know. But there is a Brussels-centric view, short of another expression, which would like to see more uniformity.
Yes.
And it's an underlying cause. And sometimes that can have good consequences.
Yes.
So, of course, if the argument is we want all the best medical service that we can imagine, possibly for free, and then we pick up an example and say we should all become like this. I mean, in a way, I sympathize with that.
But who will finance that?
Yeah, that's the question. And we entered at different stages with different histories. There are different also national health systems that work maybe okay now and which maybe could be in a mess. But I mean, the nice thing about Europe is, I mean, it's already, there is some acknowledgement of mutual rights in terms of, look, if you fall sick while being away and you're not in your home country, wherever that may be, and you're traveling around and you have an accident or an illness, and you can go with your European security card to any hospital and without paying cash. I mean, I think that is an achievement.
Yes.
Okay, how far that goes, I mean, then you could spin it further. You say, well, but I have a rare disease and, do I get the same treatment? And, and some of that is happening, but, to a limited extent. But think about other things that are a little bit more complex, social welfare systems, not just medical systems. Very hard to talk about minimal income. Some states, European states, are now experimenting with some of that. Others not. Others more conservative. Results, elections always produce different outcomes.
Yes.
It's mess.
Yeah.
It's messy. But
But it works.
To a certain extent, yeah. To a certain extent, and some things work better than others. Yeah. So.
And how do you see yourself? An Irishman?
Irish, German background with an affection or love for the Basque Country. We've been going for about 40 years, wherever it's second or third home, I should say. How do I see myself? Yeah, European, which is my first identification. Not so sure. There are also certain. Let's try to conceptualize in a different way. So I think there are universal questions, and there are particularistic moments, and human beings are always a combination of the two, and they will never dissolve into each other. So I like some of the particularisms of certain regions. I don't want them to be uniform. Yeah, I don't want to have the same shop and the same food all over the world. I like those regional components. It's the same with football, right? I mean, what's so great do you think it's a great development in the current European football system and with FIFA that you have like clubs where they're top of the league, but there's one player maybe, if at all, who was born in the city from where the team is from. What's so great about this?
It's the single market.
Yeah.
It's the power of the money. So, but what you said is captured in the EU logo, united in diversity. But you did tell me, and that should perhaps be our last question, that there is one intriguing thing about Bilbao, that it is an athletic city, and there is a twist to that story.
Yeah, there's a twist to the story. I mean, talking about the European roots here. Athletic Bilbao. So never, if you ever land in Bilbao airport, come into the city, you want to strike a conversation with the taxi driver, don't ever ask the taxi driver how Atletico Bilbao is doing. It's the wrong question.
Okay.
He will throw you out of your taxi. It's Athletic Bilbao. Athletic with TH, right? And it's named after, because there was a long relationship in the late 19th century developing. Bilbao knew the gentlemen's clubs. They copied England. It wasn't Spain. They weren't, Basque entrepreneurs. Bilbao wasn't looking at Madrid. They're looking at London. And they see gentlemen's clubs, they see football clubs, and hence, over a couple of crucial development of mass sports, let's say towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when mass sports like football developed, they decide to establish their own football team, and they call it Athletic Bilbao. And the trainer, the coach, is still called the Mister.
I see.
Yeah? He's not called whatever.
The Spanish version.
The Spanish version of it. So, interesting developments. It's Athletic Bilbao
Okay.
with TH and C and not O at the end.
Anglophiles.
And
A nation of
Anglophiles, I don't know how far that goes today. But still, I think the UK still has a great attraction for many people from the Basque Country. It's one of the first places people go to. They go to London, right? Then go to Madrid.
It's really cosmopolitan. London, that is no longer a part of the European Union.
But part of Europe.
Part of Europe, forever. Professor Andreas Hess, thank you for your time. Thanks for the interview.
Thanks for...